4 months into a marriage, I'm in rehab for 3 months. We had no idea what was going to happen to us. Nick pushed through every negative voice, I'm sure even some of her own, and she chose love. And here we are tonight, 18 years later.
In April 2024, Keith Urban stood under the lights and said the words no one expected him to say out loud. At 58, he called Nicole Kidman the love of his life, the person who pulled him back from an addiction that should have killed him. Yet less than 18 months later, that marriage was over. No scandal headlines, no public collapse, just silence. So what really happened between the confession and the goodbye? And why did the truth only surface now? The 4-month implosion. Most people think the honeymoon phase lasts for years. For Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman, it lasted exactly 120 days. 4 months after their fairy tale 2006 Sydney wedding, the marriage didn't wobble. It detonated. Not quietly, not privately, but through a full-scale intervention that forced a brutal choice almost immediately after saying, "I do." Here's the part most coverage rushes past. In October 2006, just 4 months into the marriage, Nicole Kidman organized an intervention for Keith Urban. This wasn't a rumor or a later confession leaked through tabloids. Keith himself has confirmed it repeatedly over the years. Family, friends, professionals, all gathered to confront a relapse into addiction that had followed him long before the wedding vows. The man who had just walked down the aisle was suddenly being told he might not survive without immediate help. Urban later described that moment with a word that still lands heavy: smithereens. In his own telling, his life didn't crack or bend. It shattered. That word came out years later during an emotional AFI tribute to Nicole, not in a scandal interview or a damage control press run. Standing in front of Hollywood's elite, Keith admitted that his entire world had blown apart just months into the marriage, and that the woman everyone told him to let go of was the one who stayed. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because by every rational metric, this was the exact moment Nicole Kidman should have walked away. Friends reportedly urged her to run. Advisors warned her what loving an addict can cost. Statistically, early marriage interventions don't signal stability. They signal a future filled with relapse anxiety, emotional labor, and years of uncertainty. She had everything to lose and nothing to prove, and yet she chose love anyway. That decision carried a psychological weight that rarely gets discussed. Choosing to stay doesn't mean choosing optimism. It means choosing responsibility before safety. It means accepting that your marriage may never look normal, that joy might come paired with constant vigilance, and that your partner's survival could quietly become your daily job. Keith entered rehab for 3 months. 3 out of the first 4 months of their marriage were spent apart, defined by locked facilities, therapy sessions, and the kind of internal reckoning most couples don't face in decades, if ever. When people talk about their honeymoon, Keith Urban's version involved detox, withdrawal, and the fear that the marriage might already be over before it truly began. What's rarely acknowledged is how early this dynamic set the tone for everything that followed: gratitude, guilt, dependence, devotion. Keith has repeatedly framed Nicole as the woman who saved his life, and that framing matters. When one partner becomes both spouse and savior, the emotional balance shifts in ways that feel loving at first but can grow heavy over time. In later interviews, Keith has spoken openly about how terrified he was that Nicole would leave, how her decision to stay rewired his understanding of love. That kind of devotion can inspire transformation, but it can also create a quiet pressure to live up to an impossible standard. When someone chooses you at your absolute worst, How do you ever stop trying to earn that choice again? This wasn't a marriage that eased into depth. It was thrown into the deep end immediately. The public saw red carpets and award shows. Behind the scenes, the foundation of their relationship was built during a crisis, not in calm. And that's the question that lingers beneath the romance. If a marriage is forged through an intervention rather than a honeymoon, does it create unbreakable loyalty or a debt that can never truly be repaid? Because if those first 4 months shaped everything that came after, then what happens when gratitude slowly turns into distance and survival is no longer enough to hold two people together? The ghost of Laura Sigler. Before there was Nicole, there was a woman who saw the version of Keith the world wasn't allowed to see. Long before red carpets, rehab redemption arcs, and carefully worded interviews, Keith Urban spent 8 formative years with Laura Sigler. And that relationship quietly explains far more about his later marriage than most people realize. Laura Sigler wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't part of the industry machine. She met Keith in the 1990s, when he was still grinding, still unstable, and still trying to become someone. They stayed together for nearly a decade, which in the music world is practically a lifetime. And during those years, Laura watched Keith build a public image that didn't quite match the private man she lived with. Keith has since admitted something striking about that period. He called himself a hypocrite, not in a throwaway way, in a deeply uncomfortable way. He was writing love songs about devotion, loyalty, and emotional honesty, while privately struggling to live any of it. The music sold an ideal. The reality was messier. Addiction, insecurity, emotional distance, and cycles of self-sabotage kept creeping in. Laura saw the cracks long before fans ever did. She saw the gap between the man on stage and the man off it. That gap matters, because when Keith eventually left Laura, it wasn't framed as a dramatic betrayal or scandal. It just ended, quietly. 8 years dissolved without a public narrative, which is often how the most formative relationships fade. No closure for the audience, no mythology, just absence. But Laura didn't disappear entirely. In 2006, when news broke that Keith Urban was marrying Nicole Kidman, Laura Sigler did something rare. She spoke, not loudly, not bitterly, but clearly enough to raise eyebrows. She warned that loving Keith meant loving someone who could be extraordinary and deeply flawed at the same time. Someone capable of sincerity and self-destruction in equal measure. At the time, those comments were dismissed as jealousy. Sour grapes from an ex watching her former partner marry one of the most famous women on the planet. The narrative was simple and comforting. Keith had grown. Nicole was different. This time would be different. For a long while, it seemed true. Keith stayed sober. He praised Nicole endlessly. He credited her with saving his life. Publicly, consistently, almost ritualistically. Award speeches turned into love letters. Interviews reinforced the same message. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a redemption story. But here's where Laura's ghost lingers. The hypocrite Keith described from the 1990s wasn't someone who didn't believe in love. He believed in it deeply. He just struggled to sustain it once the spotlight faded and routine set in. He could articulate devotion beautifully while privately wrestling with restlessness, self-doubt, and the pressure of being someone worthy of the words he sang. That pattern didn't magically vanish with fame or marriage. It was managed, structured, contained. Nicole's role was different from Laura's, but the underlying dynamic echoed. Where Laura had loved Keith before he became a symbol, Nicole loved him while he was becoming one. And that difference bought time, stability, structure, sobriety. But it didn't erase the tension between the public Keith and the private one. When Laura warned that loving Keith meant accepting cycles, she wasn't predicting infidelity or scandal. She was pointing to something quieter. The emotional labor required to love someone who is constantly working to outrun parts of themselves. For years, Nicole seemed willing to carry that weight. She chose love when logic said run. She stayed through rehab, through touring absences, through the constant pressure of being married to someone whose demons were never fully behind him, just carefully managed. And Keith, in return, stayed publicly perfect. That's the part that should make us pause. Because perfection maintained for nearly 2 decades doesn't usually come from ease. It comes from effort, from discipline, from suppression, from choosing the right words, even when the feelings underneath are complicated. Laura Sigler didn't predict a divorce date. She predicted a struggle. And looking back now, her warnings don't sound bitter. They sound observant. The uncomfortable truth is that the man who once called himself a hypocrite may have simply learned how to hide the contradictions better, how to live up to the songs publicly, even if privately. He was still negotiating the same internal battles. So the question isn't whether Keith Urban changed. He did, dramatically. The question is whether a change rooted in gratitude and fear of loss can last forever, once survival is no longer the main objective. And if the ghost of Laura Sigler was right about who Keith Urban really was, then how did he manage to keep everything looking so perfect for 19 years? The Jenga marriage. In 2015, Keith Urban used a word that should have sounded like a joke, but didn't. He described his home life as Jenga. One wrong move, one block pulled at the wrong time, and everything could come down. At the time, people laughed it off as a quirky metaphor for busy schedules and celebrity stress. But years later, that word reads less like humor and more like a quiet confession hiding in plain sight. Because Jenga isn't about strength. It's about balance under constant risk. By the mid-2010, Keith and Nicole were being held up as one of Hollywood's healthiest marriages. Long-lasting, drama-free, almost aggressively stable. But when you look closer at the rules they built to protect that stability, a different picture starts to form. A marriage that wasn't coasting. A marriage that was carefully engineered to avoid collapse. Take the double shower rule. Keith once explained that when they were apart for too long, especially during tours or filming schedules, they would take showers at the same time in different locations. Same hour, same routine. The idea was symbolic closeness, a way to feel connected across distance. On the surface, it sounds romantic, almost poetic. Two people syncing their lives despite geography. But there's another way to read it. Because rituals like that don't usually come from ease. They come from anxiety, from a need to reduce uncertainty, from wanting to feel in control of connection when circumstances keep pulling you apart. And then there was the no texting rule. Keith openly said that they avoided texting each other because texts could be misread. Tone lost, meaning distorted. Instead, they preferred phone calls or nothing at all. Again, framed as intentional communication, mature, thoughtful, anti-digital. But here's the tension. Texting isn't dangerous in itself. It's dangerous when there's fear of misinterpretation, when silence feels loaded, when words need to be carefully managed to avoid triggering insecurity or misunderstanding. In relationships built on trust, texting is just logistics. In relationships built on fragility, every message carries weight. This is where the power dynamic becomes impossible to ignore. From the beginning, Keith framed Nicole as the one who saved him, the anchor, the stable force. The person who chose him when logic said run. That narrative placed Nicole in a position of emotional authority, and Keith in a position of eternal gratitude. Gratitude can be beautiful, but over time, it can also become a quiet imbalance. When one partner is seen as the reason the other survived, the relationship stops being just about love. It becomes about maintenance, about not disappointing the person who stood by you when you were at your worst, about proving over and over that their faith wasn't misplaced. Keith spoke often about wanting to protect the marriage, about being intentional, about not taking it for granted. All admirable goals. But protection can easily slide into pressure, and intention can quietly become surveillance of your own behavior. Every rule they followed makes sense individually. Fewer texts, more voice calls, ritualized connection, coordinated schedules, extreme transparency. Together, though, they paint a picture of a marriage that required constant calibration. That's where the Jenga metaphor stops being cute. In Jenga, the tower stands only as long as no one makes a sudden move. You don't test the structure. You don't shake it. You pull blocks slowly, carefully, hoping nothing shifts too much. That's not how most long-term relationships survive. They survive through flexibility, through occasional mess, through allowing tension without fearing collapse. But Keith's language suggests collapse was always a possibility. And here's the part that often gets missed. Rules don't appear when things are going well. They appear when there's something to manage, when there's history to contain, when trust exists, but not effortlessly. Nicole was frequently working overseas. Keith was touring relentlessly. Distance was unavoidable. Temptation, loneliness, and old habits were real risks, not abstract ones. In that context, rules weren't about romance. They were about risk reduction. And that's not a moral failure. It's human. But it does shift how we understand marriage. Instead of a fairy tale, it looks more like a long-term containment strategy. A successful one for many years. Sobriety held. Public scandals stayed away. The family functioned. From the outside, it worked. The question is, what that kind of structure costs internally. When love becomes something you constantly manage, rather than something you occasionally lean into, exhaustion creeps in quietly. Especially when one partner is always mindful of not pulling the wrong block. Keith once said that marriage requires constant work. That's true. But there's a difference between work that builds and work that prevents collapse. The no texting rule becomes less romantic when you realize it might exist to avoid missteps rather than deepen a connection. The double shower ritual feels less poetic when you consider it might be there to soothe separation anxiety rather than celebrate intimacy. And the Jenga metaphor stops being playful when you realize it implies fear. Fear of one wrong move undoing everything they worked so hard to preserve. Here's the uncomfortable thought. What if the reason the marriage lasted 19 years isn't that it was effortless, but because both of them became experts at not disturbing the tower? Nicole carried the weight of being the stable one. Keith carried the weight of being the redeemed one. Neither role leaves much room for change once life evolves beyond crisis management. Sobriety stabilized Keith. Fame stabilized the family. Time smoothed the rough edges. But the foundation was still built during an emergency. And emergency structures aren't meant to last forever. So when people ask how such a strong-looking marriage could suddenly end, the better question might be this. What happens when a relationship built on careful balance finally reaches a point where one person is too tired to keep pulling blocks gently? Because if the marriage was always Jenga, then the ending wasn't a surprise collapse. It was the moment someone decided to stop playing the game. And that leads to another piece of this story. If the structure held for 19 years, why did it finally fall now? The 3:30 a.m. epiphany. Success has a price, and in late 2025, Keith Urban decided he was finally willing to pay it. By then, the story everyone thought they knew had already started coming apart quietly. The marriage hadn't exploded. There was no single fight, no headline moment. Instead, it unraveled in hotel rooms, tour buses, and the long, sleepless hours that arrive when the noise fades and you're left alone with your thoughts. Keith later described that period with a phrase that stopped people cold. He said life on the road had made him lonely and miserable. That confession matters more than it seems. Because touring is where Keith is supposed to feel most alive. It's where the crowds roar, the adrenaline spikes, and the creative rush hits hardest. For most artists, the road is exhausting but validating. For Keith, it had become something else entirely. A place where success amplified isolation instead of curing it. The 2025 World Tour was massive, sold-out arenas, tight schedules, constant movement. From the outside, it looked like triumph. Inside, it was where the distance between him and Nicole finally became impossible to ignore. Keith spoke openly about waking up around 3:30 in the morning on tour, unable to sleep. Not because of jet lag or noise, but because his mind wouldn't shut off. Those early hours became a kind of reckoning space. No band, no audience, no obligations, just silence. That's when the realization crept in. He wasn't just tired, he was unhappy. And not in a fleeting, tour-weary way, in a deeper, more unsettling sense. The kind that doesn't disappear after a rest day or a hit show. The kind that forces you to ask whether the life you've built is still aligned with who you are now. Here's where the contrast becomes uncomfortable. While Keith was on tour chasing creative momentum, Nicole was reportedly struggling. Not publicly, not dramatically, but emotionally. Years of holding the center, years of adapting schedules, years of being the steady one. According to accounts close to the situation, she was worn down. The very strength that had once held the marriage together had started to fray. And Keith felt it. That's the cruel paradox of long-term relationships built on crisis survival. When one person finally stabilizes and starts chasing growth again, the other is often left carrying the exhaustion of having held everything together for years. Keith admitted that being away made him feel miserable, but coming home didn't fix it either. That's the detail most people miss. His loneliness wasn't just about distance, it followed him. Which suggests the problem wasn't geography, it was internal misalignment. If Nicole represented safety, stability, and survival, the road represented freedom, momentum, and reinvention. Those two forces had coexisted for nearly 2 decades, but by 2025, they were pulling in opposite directions. Keith was no longer fighting to stay sober. That battle had been won. He was no longer trying to prove he could be dependable. He'd done that too. The question he was facing at 3:30 in the morning wasn't about whether he could survive. It was about whether he was allowed to want more. That's a dangerous question in a marriage built on gratitude. Because how do you tell the person who saved your life that the life you share no longer fits? How do you express restlessness without sounding ungrateful? How do you chase a new version of yourself without dismantling the foundation that made your current life possible? Keith's misery wasn't about Nicole as a person. It was about the roles they had both been trapped in for years. The savior, the redeemed, the stable one, the grateful one. Those roles work in emergencies. They don't age well. By late 2025, the emotional math stopped adding up. Keith has said that touring made him feel disconnected from himself. That's telling. Artists often describe the road as escapism. For Keith, it became a mirror. The louder the applause, the clearer the quiet dissatisfaction became afterwards. And here's the hardest truth. Sometimes loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about not recognizing yourself in the life you're living anymore. Nicole and Keith had built something remarkable. A family, stability, a public narrative of endurance. But endurance isn't the same as fulfillment. And when the emergency that once bonded you fades, you're left facing the parts of yourself you postponed. The 3:30 a.m. epiphany wasn't dramatic. It wasn't announced. It wasn't shared with the world in real time. It was a slow, private acknowledgement that the version of Keith Urban who needed saving was no longer the version standing on stage every night. That realization doesn't make anyone a villain, but it does force choices. Nicole, by all accounts, was emotionally depleted. Keith was creatively restless. The marriage had become the place where both of those truths collided, and no amount of rules, rituals, or careful block pulling could stop that collision forever. This is where people misunderstand the breakup. They look for betrayal, for scandal, for a single breaking point. What they miss is the accumulation. Years of unspoken adjustments, years of silent compromise, years of honoring a past version of the relationship while outgrowing it. Keith, calling himself lonely and miserable, wasn't a complaint. It was a confession, an admission that success had finally given him the space to hear what he'd been avoiding. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. If Nicole was truly the love of his life, why did the life they built together start to feel like the loneliest place he knew? Because the answer to that question doesn't live in scandal. It lives in what happens when survival turns into stagnation, and gratitude quietly becomes a cage. And that's where this story has to end. The final confession at 58. On January 6, 2026, the legal tether was finally cut. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown, no leaked security footage of a shouting match, and no public accusations of betrayal. It was just paperwork, cold, sterile, and absolute. But buried inside those filings was the quiet, devastating truth of who these two people had become after 19 years of being Hollywood's North Star couple. The divorce decree revealed a logistical detail that most tabloid headlines glossed over, but it's the most telling piece of evidence we have. Custody of their teenage daughters wasn't split down the middle. It wasn't the standard alternating weeks or shared holidays we see in amicable splits. The math was jarring. Keith Urban would spend just 59 days a year with his children. Nicole Kidman would have them for 306. That number isn't just a statistic. It's a map of a broken home. It's the physical manifestation of a father who had become a guest in his own life. 59 days. That's barely one day a week. In the architectural landscape of a 19-year marriage, that is no longer a shared life. It is a visitation schedule. It's the legal acknowledgement that the home had become a headquarters for one and a hotel for the other. It reflects a reality where Keith's life was still built entirely around the centrifugal force of touring schedules, sound checks, and the relentless movement of the road. Meanwhile, Nicole's world was built around the heavy, stationary anchors of stability and presence. This ratio tells the story that the perfect red carpet photos never could. Custody arrangements like this don't happen by accident. They are the result of grueling negotiations where one parent has to admit, legally and on the record, that they simply cannot show up. It's the paperwork equivalent of hanging a closed sign on the door of the family unit. The court didn't just look at his calendar. It looked at the vacuum his absence had created over the last decade. In the end, the court didn't care about Keith's Grammy wins or his status as a country music deity. It looked at his lifestyle. And that lifestyle, the one he chose to maintain at 58, was no longer compatible with the family structure he spent 2 decades claiming was his priority. This is where Keith's final confession truly takes shape. He never said he stopped loving Nicole. In fact, he did the opposite. Even as the lawyers were drafting the 306-day split, Keith continued to use the language of reverence. He called her the love of his life. Not a past love, not the woman who saved him once, but the definitive love. Full stop. But here is the hidden truth. Love, on its own, is a terrible architect for a life. The divorce terms made it clear that Keith had reached a crossroads and made a conscious, agonizing choice. He chose motion over stillness. He chose the roar of the arena over the silence of the breakfast table. He chose the version of himself that only exists when a spotlight is shining on him. The tragedy is that Nicole could save him from his addictions in 2006 because addiction was an external enemy, a monster they could fight together. There was a clear crisis and a clear direction: sobriety. But fame isn't like fentanyl. It doesn't destroy you in obvious, ugly ways. It rewards you while it hollows you out. It's a slow, seductive hollowing that replaces the difficult, quiet intimacy of a partner with the cheap, loud validation of 10,000 strangers in a darkened arena. It gives you a sense of purpose that quietly, year by year, pulls you away from anything that requires you to just sit still. By the time 2025 rolled around, Keith wasn't choosing between Nicole and chaos. He was choosing between the woman he loved and the adrenaline that gave him his identity. The paradox is that calling her the love of his life wasn't a lie. It was an admission of failure. It was his way of saying that love, as massive as it was, simply wasn't enough to compete with the high of the road. That's the real confession at 58. Not that the fire went out, but that he decided he'd rather keep traveling than stay home and keep it burning. He didn't just walk away from a marriage. He walked away from the version of himself he had to maintain to keep that marriage alive. At 58, the cost of being Nicole's Keith finally became higher than the cost of being alone on the road. And that choice raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If the road gave him the freedom that love no longer could, was it actually freedom? Or was the road just another dependency wearing a much prettier mask? The addiction of the road. Sobriety isn't just about the bottle. For Keith Urban, it was about the adrenaline of the crowd. After rehab, substances were gone. Alcohol was gone. But the brain that once chased intensity didn't disappear. It adapted. The road became the new fix. The lights, the noise, the constant movement, the validation that arrives every night and disappears by morning. Unlike substances, touring is celebrated. It's rewarded. It's framed as passion. But neurologically, it hits the same buttons: dopamine, escape, reinvention. You're never stuck long enough to feel restless, because the next city is always waiting. Nicole could pull Keith back from addiction because addiction was destroying his life. The road was being built. That made it untouchable. And that's the cruel irony. The very thing that kept Keith sober may have been the thing that made staying impossible. Fame didn't ruin the marriage overnight. It slowly replaced intimacy with momentum. Which leaves us with one final question to sit with. If the road saved him from himself, but cost him the love of his life, was it recovery or just a different kind of addiction? Keith Urban spent 2 decades convincing us, and maybe himself, that he was a changed man. At 58, he's finally free, but at the cost of the woman he called his savior. Was the love of his life just another song he couldn't quite finish? Let me know in the comments. Do you think Keith will regret pulling the plug?